December 11, 1939, the 163rd Rifle Division of the Soviet Red Army, 14,000 men, artillery batteries, supply trucks, and tanks, crosses into Finland near the small town of Suomussalmi. Their orders are simple: cut Finland in half, drive west to the Swedish border, sever the country at its narrow waist, isolate the Finnish forces in the north from those in the south. Stalin wants this war finished by the new year. The 163rd will make it happen, except the 163rd Rifle Division is about to disappear, not retreat, not withdraw, disappear, vanish into the snow-choked forests of Kainuu province, as if the earth itself swallowed them whole. And when Moscow sends the 44th Rifle Division, another 17,000 soldiers, decorated veterans from the Ukrainian military district, elite troops with combat experience, to find out what happened, they too will be erased from existence. This is Suomussalmi. This is where the Winter War turns into a nightmare that Soviet generals will spend decades trying to forget. The plan looks perfect on paper. The Red Army massively outnumbers the Finns, over 1 million Soviet soldiers versus Finland's roughly 300,000 defenders. Soviet artillery outnumbers Finnish guns by 30-1. The Soviets have thousands of tanks. Finland has exactly 30. Stalin's generals assure him the Finnish defenses will collapse within weeks. The 163rd Rifle Division's mission fits neatly into this arithmetic. They'll advance along the few roads that cut through Finland's endless forests, seize key towns, link up with other Soviet units, and watch Finland sue for peace. But Finland doesn't fight by Moscow's arithmetic. The 163rd crosses the border and immediately encounters problems. The temperature hovers at -20 Celsius. The roads, barely roads at all, more like logging trails, disappear beneath 2 feet of snow. The forests press in from both sides, dense walls of pine and spruce that reduce visibility to mere meters. Soviet columns stretch out along these narrow passages, unable to deploy off-road, unable to maneuver. Trucks break down, tanks churn uselessly in snowdrifts, and the Finnish resistance? Invisible. A few rifle shots crack from the tree line, then silence. A truck explodes from a mine. Supply columns get hit, supplies vanish. Finnish troops melt back into the forest before Soviet units can respond. Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo commands the Finnish forces at Suomussalmi. He has 4,000 men. Most are not professional soldiers. They're farmers, loggers, hunters, men who spent their entire lives in these forests. They know the terrain the way a sailor knows the sea. They move on skis through woods that would swallow Soviet units whole. They dress in white snow capes that render them invisible against the landscape. They strike without warning and withdraw before the Soviets can even identify where the attack came from. The 163rd captures Suomussalmi village on December 11th, a hollow victory. The Finns have evacuated the civilians, burned anything useful, and fallen back into defensive positions in the surrounding forests. Now the 163rd sits in an empty town, their supply lines stretched thin, their units scattered across dozens of kilometers of hostile terrain, and Finnish ski troops prowling the darkness like wolves. Siilasvuo doesn't try to hold ground. He doesn't need to. His men cut the Soviet supply columns into pieces. They attack at night during snowstorms, at dawn when exhausted Soviet sentries can barely keep their eyes open. They destroy bridges, they mine the roads, they shoot drivers, commissars, officers, anyone whose death creates maximum chaos. The Soviets call in artillery, but Finnish positions have already shifted. They send patrols into the forest, patrols that rarely return. By mid-December, the 163rd Rifle Division is dying, not in dramatic charges or heroic last stands, but through slow strangulation. Supplies don't arrive. Fuel runs out. Food dwindles. Medical supplies vanish. The cold becomes an enemy more relentless than any Finnish rifle. Frostbite claims fingers, toes, entire limbs. Soldiers huddle around campfires that mark their positions for Finnish snipers. Units lose communication with each other, scattered along roads they can't leave. Trapped between forests they dare not enter, Moscow receives increasingly desperate reports from the 163rd's commanders. They need reinforcements, they need supplies, they need support. Stalin orders the 44th Rifle Division to march north from the Ladoga region. The 44th is a mechanized division, tanks, armored cars, trucks, artillery. These are experienced troops. They'll smash through whatever Finnish forces are causing problems, link up with the 163rd, and complete the mission. The 44th begins its march on Christmas Eve. 17,000 men moving north along the Rata Road, the only viable route to Suomussalmi. The road cuts through 50 kilometers of unbroken wilderness, dense forest on both sides, lakes frozen solid, swamps buried under snow. The column stretches for kilometers, trucks, tanks, horse-drawn supply wagons, soldiers marching in formation. They're confident. They're well-equipped. They're marching into a trap that will become one of the most devastating tactical defeats in military history. Siilas Vuo watches the 44th approach. His 4,000 Finns are now facing over 30,000 Soviet soldiers from 2 divisions. The arithmetic says he should retreat, conserve his forces, wait for reinforcements that aren't coming. Instead, he does something audacious. He decides to destroy both divisions simultaneously. The technique has a name, motti. It's a Finnish word meaning a bundle of logs stacked for cutting. Siilas Vuo will cut the Soviet columns into mottas, isolated pockets, surrounded, severed from support, left to freeze and starve in the wilderness. He'll use the terrain, the cold, and the mobility of his ski troops to turn Soviet numerical superiority into a liability. Large formations need roads, supplies, communication. Cut those arteries, and massive armies become collections of dying men. December 27th. Finnish troops hit the 44th Division's advance units. Not a frontal assault, surgical strikes along the column, a bridge demolished here, an ambush there, supply trucks burning in the snow. The 44th pushes forward, expecting the Finnish resistance to break. It doesn't break. It multiplies. The forests that seemed empty suddenly teem with Finnish ski troops appearing, attacking, vanishing. The 44th's tanks can't leave the road. Their artillery can't spot targets in the dense woods. Their superior numbers mean nothing when the front is a single-lane road and the enemy refuses to stand still. Soviet units bunch up, creating traffic jams that become killing zones. Finnish machine guns rake the road from concealed positions. Mortars drop shells on stalled columns. Soldiers die without ever seeing who killed them. The 163rd Division, still trapped around Suomussalmi, hears the sounds of battle from the Rata Road. Help is coming. They just need to hold on. But help isn't coming. The 44th Division is already being dismembered, cut into pieces, each piece surrounded and isolated. The mottis are forming, and in Finland's winter, a motti is a death sentence. The right road is 65 kilometers of frozen hell connecting the Soviet staging areas to Suomussalmi. In peacetime, it's barely a road, a dirt track used by loggers hauling timber, winding through terrain that belongs more to wilderness than civilization. Lakes freeze solid on both sides. Swamps become snow-covered traps. Pine forests crowd so close that in places 2 trucks can barely pass each other. Now, in late December 1939, this road carries the entire 44th Rifle Division, 17,000 men. Trucks carrying supplies, ammunition, fuel, 43 tanks, artillery pieces hauled by tractors and horses, field kitchens, command vehicles, medical units, everything a modern mechanized division needs to wage war, all funneled onto a single road because there is no other road. The forests won't allow movement. The lakes and swamps, frozen but unstable, make cross-country travel suicidal. So the 44th marches in column, stretched across dozens of kilometers, and every kilometer makes them more vulnerable. Colonel Siilas Vuo studies his maps in a farmhouse-turned-command post. He's marking positions, calculating distances, planning cuts. His intelligence officers report the 44th's progress hourly. Finnish scouts on skis shadow the Soviet column, counting vehicles, identifying units, noting where the column bunches up and where it stretches thin. Siilas Vuo sees what the Soviet commanders cannot see. Their strength is their weakness. That enormous column represents massive firepower and manpower, but it's locked to the road like a train to its tracks. Cut the tracks, and the train stops. Isolate the cars, and they can't support each other. The Finnish plan is surgical. Don't hit the column head-on. That plays to Soviet strengths. Instead, attack the joints. Cut the column into sections. Surround each section. Prevent reinforcement. Let the cold, hunger, and isolation do the rest. The Finns call these isolated pockets mottis. The Soviets will learn to call them mass graves. December 28th, the first cuts begin. Finnish ski troops, Jekari battalions, trained for exactly this kind of warfare, strike at multiple points simultaneously. They're not attacking to seize ground, they're attacking to sever. A bridge over a frozen stream gets demolished. Trees felled across the road create obstacles. Machine gun nests positioned in the forest rake passing vehicles, then disappear before Soviet units can respond. The 44th's advance slows, stops, starts again, stops. Soviet commanders order engineers forward to clear obstacles. Finnish snipers kill the engineers. Soviet infantry deploys into the forest to hunt the attackers. The infantry finds nothing, just tracks in the snow leading away. And by the time they follow, Finnish ski troops have already repositioned and struck somewhere else. The Finns move at 6 kilometers per hour on skis through terrain where Soviet soldiers struggle to walk. The 44th's commander, Kombrig Alexei Vinogradov, pushes his units harder. His orders from Moscow are explicit. Relieve the 163rd Division, destroy Finnish resistance, complete the breakthrough to Sweden. Delays are unacceptable. Stalin doesn't tolerate failure. Vinogradov knows what happens to commanders who fail Stalin, so he drives his men forward, ignoring warning signs, dismissing reports of Finnish troops in the forests, convinced that Soviet firepower will prevail once his division concentrates its forces. But concentration requires space, and the Rat Road offers none. The column can't deploy, can't maneuver, can't bring its superior numbers to bear. When Finnish attacks intensify, Soviet units respond by clustering together for mutual support, exactly what Siilasvuo wants them to do. Clustered units consume supplies faster. They present better targets. They clog the road and prevent reinforcement from reaching forward elements. By December 30th, the 44th Division has been cut into 4 major segments. Each segment contains thousands of men, vehicles, weapons, all now isolated from each other by Finnish positions across the road. The segments try to break through, to reconnect, to restore the column's integrity. Finnish ski troops hit them from the forests, then fade away. Soviet artillery shells empty woods. Soviet tanks fire into tree lines where no targets exist. Ammunition expenditure becomes catastrophic, and resupply is now impossible because the Finns control the roads between the segments. The temperature drops to -35°C, then -40°. This isn't cold like civilians understand cold. This is cold that kills exposed skin in minutes. Soviet soldiers, most from Ukraine, many who had never seen winter like this, begin dying from exposure. They don't have winter clothing adequate for this climate. They don't have fuel to run vehicle engines for warmth. They light fires, and Finnish mortars drop shells on the fires. They huddle together in the snow, and Finnish machine guns cut them down. The Finns, meanwhile, move through this frozen hell like it's home territory. These men grew up here. They hunt in these forests, fish these lakes, know every trail and hillside. They wear layered clothing, proper boots, white camouflage. They carry field rations designed for winter. They know how to build shelters in the snow, how to stay warm, how to survive. The climate that's killing the Soviets barely inconveniences them. Siilasvuo orders his men to tighten the noose. Each motti gets surrounded by Finnish positions, not solid lines, but networks of machine gun nests, sniper positions, mortar teams, all positioned in terrain Soviet forces can't reach. The Finns don't try to overrun Soviet positions. They don't need to. They just need to keep the Soviets contained while winter does the work. Inside the mottis, conditions deteriorate rapidly. Soviet soldiers eat through their rations. Ammunition runs low. Fuel vanishes. Medical supplies prove inadequate for the mounting casualties: frostbite, wounds, illness, exhaustion. Commanders try to organize breakouts, but breakouts require coordination between mottis, and coordination is impossible when Finnish ski troops control everything between the pockets. Radio communications become sporadic, then fail entirely as batteries freeze and equipment breaks down. The psychological impact proves as devastating as the physical. Soviet soldiers sit in snowdrifts, surrounded by dead comrades, listening to Finnish ski troops circling in the darkness. They hear the whisper of skis on snow, the crack of distant rifle fire, the screams of patrols ambushed in the forest. They don't know where the enemy is. They don't know how many enemies surround them. They just know that every attempt to move, to fight back, to break out, ends in more dead Russians freezing in the snow. Finnish propagandists have a name for their ski troops, the White Death. Soviet soldiers adopt the term, whispered in frozen foxholes, spoken with a terror usually reserved for supernatural threats. The White Death comes at night, comes during snowstorms, comes at dawn when exhaustion makes sentries careless. It kills officers first, then machine gunners, then anyone who looks like they might organize resistance. It strikes without warning and vanishes without trace. Back at Suomussalmi, the 163rd Division hears nothing from the 44th. No relief column appears. Finnish pressure intensifies. The 163rd's commanders realize they're not being reinforced, they're being left to die. Some units attempt to break out eastward, back toward Soviet lines. Finnish troops massacre them in the forests. Other units dig in around the village, hoping to hold until spring, until thaw, until somehow this nightmare ends. It won't end. Not for them. C.O. has devoted enough troops to contain the 163rd, while he focuses on destroying the 44th. Once the 44th Division is annihilated, he'll turn his full attention to finishing the 163rd. The timeline is brutally clear. The 44th has days left. The 163rd has perhaps a week. Both divisions, 30,000 men who cross the border confident in Soviet superiority, will cease to exist as fighting formations. Most won't make it home. Many won't even get proper graves. The Rate Road, that insignificant logging track, becomes a monument to what happens when tactical incompetence meets tactical genius in the worst possible terrain. Every kilometer of that road now holds frozen Soviet soldiers, burned vehicles, abandoned equipment. The snow covers them temporarily, but spring will reveal the magnitude of the disaster. For now, the killing continues. The modest tighten. And the White Death circles, patient as winter itself. They move like smoke through the pines. White-clad figures on skis, silent except for the soft whisper of wood gliding over snow. No engine noise, no shouted commands, no heavy boots crunching through drifts. Just the forest, the cold, and men who know this terrain better than they know their own homes. These are Finland's ski troops, Jekari battalions, reconnaissance units, local militias, and they're rewriting the rules of winter warfare with every silent approach, every sudden ambush, every impossible maneuver through terrain the Soviets consider impassable. The Soviet Army trains for European warfare. Broad fronts, artillery barrages, tank advances, infantry waves. Doctrine written for the plains of Poland or the fields of France. But Finland isn't Europe in the traditional sense. 70% forest, 10% lakes, the rest? Swamps, hills, and rock. Roads barely exist. Logging trails carved through wilderness, most unusable in winter. The Red Army brings its European tactics here and discovers they're fighting a different war entirely. Finnish ski troops exploit every advantage this terrain provides. A Soviet column holds a 5-kilometer stretch of road. Finnish scouts identify weak points, where the column thins, where vehicles bunch up, where sentries look inward instead of outward. Orders go out through runners, not radios. Finnish doctrine emphasizes decentralized command. Officers trust their men to act independently, to make decisions based on immediate conditions rather than wait for orders from headquarters. It makes them fluid, adaptive, impossible to predict. The attack plan is simple. 3 ski sections, 30 men total, will hit the column simultaneously at 3 points. No preparatory bombardment, no warning. Just men appearing from the forest, firing, withdrawing before Soviet forces can organize a response. The goal isn't to destroy the column. 30 men can't destroy 1,000. The goal is to create chaos, kill specific targets, and disappear. At 4 a.m., the forest so dark that Soviet sentries can't see beyond their immediate positions. 3 kilometers from the road, Finnish ski troops begin their approach. They move in single file, each man following the tracks of the one ahead, minimizing visible traces. They're carrying Suomi KP.31 submachine guns, Finnish designed weapons that function flawlessly in extreme cold when Soviet weapons freeze and jam. They're carrying grenades, extra magazines, and nothing else. No heavy equipment. No rations beyond what fits in a pocket. Speed and silence matter more than firepower. They stop 300 meters from the road. The column is visible now. Trucks parked nose to tail, soldiers huddled around fires that give away their positions perfectly. Soviet doctrine mandates defensive perimeters, but exhaustion and cold erode discipline. Guards stamp their feet and blow on their hands instead of watching the tree line. Fires hypnotize tired men, destroying their night vision while advertising their locations. The Finnish section leader raises his hand. His men fan out, finding cover behind trees and snowdrifts. They're invisible. White capes blending with snow, faces wrapped in white cloth, weapons stripped of anything reflective. They wait. Patience is a Finnish virtue. The Soviets are going nowhere. There's time to choose the perfect moment. A Soviet officer emerges from a command truck. He's shouting orders, organizing a supply distribution. The section leader marks him. Officers die first, always. Kill the leaders, and Soviet formations collapse into confusion. The Red Army's rigid hierarchical structure makes it effective when properly led, but catastrophically vulnerable when leadership vanishes. The section leader fires a single shot. The officer drops. Then hell erupts from the forest. 30 submachine guns opening fire simultaneously. Soviet soldiers scatter, diving for cover, returning fire blindly into the darkness. But the Finns are already moving, skiing laterally along the tree line, changing positions, creating the impression of a force far larger than 30 men. They throw grenades toward the fires, not to kill, but to force soldiers away from light and warmth into the darkness where terror lives. 90 seconds. That's how long the attack lasts. 90 seconds of concentrated violence. Then the Finns vanish back into the forest. They don't stay to assess damage or count casualties. They're already 300 meters away, skiing hard through routes they reconnoitered earlier, routes no Soviet unit could follow. Behind them, the Soviet column descends into chaos. Commanders shout contradictory orders. Soldiers fire at shadows. Vehicle engines start, consuming precious fuel as drivers panic and prepare to flee. The casualties aren't catastrophic, maybe 20 dead, 30 wounded, but the psychological damage is immense. This pattern repeats dozens of times each night along the entire length of the Rate Road. Small Finnish units hitting isolated Soviet positions, killing, withdrawing, disappearing. The Soviets never face a major Finnish formation they can engage with their superior firepower. They face ghosts, shadows, the whisper of skis on snow followed by muzzle flashes from the darkness. Soviet commanders try every countermeasure doctrine provides. They establish wider perimeters. Finnish ski troops simply attack from farther away. They send patrols into the forest, patrols that vanish or return having found nothing. They light flares, illuminating empty forest, while Finnish troops wait in positions the flares don't reach. They employ their own ski troops, inadequately trained soldiers from southern regions who flounder in snow and terrain. Their Finnish counterparts navigate effortlessly. The Finns introduce innovations that seem impossible to Soviet military thinking. They cut the road, isolate a motti, then instead of assaulting it, they simply maintain the encirclement. Soviet forces inside the motti eventually attempt a breakout. Finnish troops establish killing zones along the likely breakout routes, pre-positioned machine guns with interlocking fields of fire, carefully chosen spots where terrain funnels Soviet soldiers into open ground. When the breakout comes, Finnish gunners slaughter the attackers, then withdraw before Soviet artillery can respond. One Finnish innovation proves particularly devastating: the close assault on Soviet strong points. Soviet units dig in, establish defensive positions, and wait for Finnish attacks. The Finns oblige, but not with frontal assaults. Small teams ski to within meters of Soviet positions at night. They identify command bunkers, ammunition dumps, supply points. They attack with grenades, satchel charges, and close-range automatic fire, then withdraw before defenders can coordinate a response. Leadership decapitated, supplies destroyed, and the White Death melts back into darkness. Lieutenant Matti Hutola commands a ski reconnaissance platoon, 40 men responsible for a 10-kilometer sector. His mission: prevent Soviet movement, gather intelligence, and tie down forces far larger than his own. Huhtala's platoon is outnumbered 50-1. They compensate through mobility and knowledge of terrain. Huhtala knows every trail, every frozen stream, every hill that offers good observation. He knows where lakes ice over thick enough to support skiers, but not heavy enough for trucks. He knows where forests grow dense enough to hide his men 10 meters from a road. His platoon splits into 4 sections, each operating independently but coordinated through runners who ski between positions. One section observes a Soviet motti from concealed positions, counting soldiers, noting defensive measures, identifying targets for later raids. Another section lays mines on a road the Soviets might use for resupply. The third section rests in the forest, maintaining weapons, eating, sleeping in shifts, while sentries watch for Soviet patrols. The fourth section hits a Soviet supply column, destroying 3 trucks before withdrawing. Huhtala's men have been in continuous combat for 2 weeks. They're exhausted, hungry, running low on ammunition. But they're winning. The motti they're monitoring contains 2,000 Soviet soldiers who haven't received supplies in days. Every night, Huhtala's sections hit them. A sniper kills a sentry. A machine gun rakes a supply point. Grenades explode near command positions. The Soviets fire back, waste ammunition shooting at empty forest, exhaust themselves staying alert for attacks that come from unexpected directions at unexpected times. This is how Finland fights, not through grand battles or massive formations, but through thousands of small actions executed by men who understand the terrain gives them advantages no amount of Soviet numerical superiority can overcome. The Red Army brings tanks that can't leave roads, artillery that can't target enemies they can't see, infantry trained for different warfare in different climates. Finland brings men on skis who appear, kill, and vanish like winter storms, impossible to predict, impossible to stop, impossible to defeat through conventional means. Soviet after-action reports, those that survive, describe an enemy that seems supernatural. Finnish forces appear in impossible places at impossible times. They attack through terrain Soviet maps mark as impassable. They move silently, strike without warning, and withdraw before reinforcements arrive. Soviet intelligence estimates Finnish strength at 5 times actual numbers because commanders can't believe so few troops could inflict such damage. But Siilasvuo's 4,000 men aren't supernatural. They're farmers and hunters and loggers who spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this fight, even if they didn't know it. Every winter hunting elk through deep snow, every summer fishing remote lakes, every autumn cutting timber in forests where getting lost means death. This knowledge, intimate, instinctive, earned through lifetimes spent in this landscape, transforms ordinary men into the most effective winter warfare specialists the world has ever seen. The modest Titan. The temperature drops, and the White Death skis through the darkness, patient as winter, relentless as the cold. January 1st, 1940. New Year's Day arrives at minus 42 degrees Celsius. Inside the Soviet mottos scattered along the Rate Road, there are no celebrations, no toasts to the new year, no optimism about what comes next. There is only cold, hunger, fear, and the growing certainty that help will not arrive. The 44th Division's largest motti, designated Motti 6 by Finnish intelligence, contains approximately 4,000 Soviet soldiers. They hold a 2-kilometer stretch of road surrounded by dense forest, now controlled by Finnish ski troops. A week ago, these men were confident. They had tanks, artillery, supplies, numerical superiority. They expected to sweep aside whatever Finnish resistance existed and link up with the 163rd Division within days. Now they're dying, not from Finnish bullets primarily. They're dying from the cold, from wounds that in normal circumstances would be survivable, but here, without adequate medical supplies or evacuation, become death sentences. The motti's perimeter is chaos frozen in place. Trucks abandoned where they stalled, buried now under snow. A T-26 tank sits immobile, its engine seized, crew dead inside from carbon monoxide poisoning, when they tried to run it for warmth. Supply wagons tipped over, their contents looted by desperate soldiers. And everywhere, bodies. Some killed in Finnish attacks, others dead from exposure, curled in the snow, wearing inadequate uniforms. Their faces peaceful in that terrible way that frozen corpses appear peaceful. Soviet soldiers dig into the snow, creating bunkers, foxholes, anything offering shelter from wind and Finnish fire. They lack proper tools, entrenching shovels frozen solid or lost during the retreat into the motti. They dig with hands, with helmets, with anything that moves snow. The bunkers they create are crude, holes scraped into snowdrifts, roofed with pine branches and canvas torn from trucks. These shelters protect against wind, but not against cold. The temperature inside a snow bunker hovers around -30, better than -40, but still cold enough to kill. Food becomes the obsession. The motti's supply situation collapsed days ago. Soldiers receive perhaps a cup of thin soup daily, sometimes a piece of hardtack, rarely anything more. They eat horses, the artillery horses, the supply wagon horses, slaughtered and butchered in the snow. They eat leather from boots and belts, boiled into a gelatinous mass that provides minimal nutrition but fills empty stomachs temporarily. Some units report soldiers eating frozen corpses, though commanders shoot anyone caught doing this. Discipline must be maintained, even here. Even now, water presents an impossible problem. Surrounded by snow, soldiers should have unlimited water. But eating snow accelerates hypothermia. Consuming frozen snow forces the body to expend calories, warming it. Calories these starving men don't have. They need to melt snow, which requires fire, which requires fuel. Fuel is gone. Some burn wooden truck beds, fence posts, anything combustible. Others resort to eating snow despite knowing it hastens their deaths. Choice between dying today from thirst or tomorrow from cold stops being a choice. The Finnish encirclement is mathematically elegant. Siilasvuo positions his troops not in continuous lines but in strong points covering the most likely Soviet breakout routes. Machine gun nests positioned where forest opens into clearings. Sniper positions overlooking the road. Mortar teams on high ground with pre-calculated ranges to every point inside the motti. The Finns don't need to occupy every meter of terrain. They just need to control the crucial terrain that Soviet forces must cross to escape. Finnish casualties remain remarkably low. They fight from prepared positions using tactics refined through weeks of continuous combat. When Soviets attack, Finnish troops withdraw to secondary positions, call in mortar fire on their abandoned positions, then reoccupy once the Soviet assault exhausts itself. When Soviets try infiltrating through the forest at night, Finnish ski patrols intercept them. The terrain that protects Finns from Soviet firepower also channels Soviet movement into predictable patterns Finnish commanders exploit ruthlessly. Inside Motti 6, the Soviet command structure begins disintegrating. The division commander, Kombrig Vinogradov, issues orders that make no sense. Attack north, then south, then north again. He demands units that no longer exist report their status. He threatens subordinates with execution for failures beyond their control. The stress, the cold, the mounting casualties crack him. His staff officers work around him, trying to organize a coherent defense, while their commander descends into denial and rage. Lower-ranking officers face impossible situations. A captain commands what remains of his rifle company, 97 men out of the original 200. 40 are wounded. 20 more show signs of severe frostbite. The captain has no medical supplies beyond a few bandages. He has ammunition for perhaps one more engagement. He has no food to distribute. His men look at him expecting leadership, expecting solutions, and he has nothing to give them except orders to hold positions they lack the strength to defend. Soviet breakout attempts follow predictable patterns. Officers organize assault groups, soldiers given the best remaining weapons and any available ammunition. The plan: punch through Finnish lines at a single point, establish a corridor, evacuate the motti through that corridor. The reality: assault groups advance into carefully prepared Finnish killing zones. Machine guns open fire from multiple positions. Mortars drop shells on pre-registered coordinates. The assault groups die in the snow without reaching Finnish lines. let alone breaking through them. One breakout attempt on January 2nd involves 300 men, nearly a quarter of Motti 6's remaining effective strength. They attack at dawn, moving through heavy forest the Finns supposedly can't cover. Finnish intelligence anticipated this route. Ski troops established positions overnight. The Soviet assault walks into interlocking machine gun fire from 3 directions. 90 men reach Finnish positions, hand-to-hand fighting in the snow, bayonets, knives, rifle butts, desperate men grappling in the cold. The Finns withdraw systematically, falling back to secondary positions, while mortars shell the breakthrough point. The surviving Soviet soldiers, perhaps 40 men, find themselves isolated beyond the Motti's perimeter, surrounded by forest, with Finnish troops between them and their comrades. By nightfall, Finnish ski patrols have hunted down all 40. None return to the Motti. The psychological warfare proves as devastating as the physical siege. Finnish troops call out to Soviet positions in Russian. Many Finnish soldiers from border regions speak Russian fluently. They tell the Soviets to surrender, that they'll receive food and medical care as prisoners. They describe the warm shelters waiting for those who lay down weapons. They tell the truth, that no relief column is coming, that Moscow has abandoned them, that their only choice is surrender or death. Some Soviets believe the propaganda. Small groups emerge from the Motti carrying white flags, bed sheets, torn shirts, anything indicating surrender. Finnish troops accept these surrenders professionally, disarm the prisoners, and march them to rear areas where they receive food, medical attention, and shelter. These prisoners later tell Finnish interrogators about conditions inside the Mottis, information WWII uses to refine his tactics. The prisoners also tell other Soviets after the war about how Finns treated them humanely, contrary to Soviet propaganda about Finnish atrocities. But during the battle, most Soviet soldiers fear surrender more than death. Political officers threaten to kill any man who surrenders and promise reprisals against soldiers' families if they're captured. These threats keep most men fighting, even when fighting becomes pointless. The cold continues its work. Frostbite casualties exceed combat casualties by January 3rd. Soldiers lose fingers, toes, ears, noses. Wounds freeze, preventing bleeding, but also preventing healing. Gangrene sets in. Men die from infected frostbite as surely as they die from bullets. The medical staff, what remains of them, operate in impossible conditions. They perform amputations with inadequate anesthesia in snow bunkers by flashlight. They lack antibiotics, proper surgical tools, even clean bandages. They watch men die from treatable conditions and can do nothing. Soviet artillery, once a fearsome advantage, becomes useless. Ammunition exhausted in pointless bombardments of empty forest. Frozen mechanisms jamming. Gun crews dead or incapacitated. The tanks sit silent, frozen monuments to technological superiority rendered irrelevant by terrain and temperature. The radios no longer function, batteries dead, equipment frozen, and no one left who knows how to fix them. By January 5th, Motti 6 contains perhaps 2,000 living soldiers out of the original 4,000. Half those survivors are wounded or frostbitten. They've eaten everything edible and many things that aren't. They've burned everything burnable. They're surrounded by Finnish forces they can't defeat, in terrain they can't navigate, at temperatures they can't survive. They're waiting for death or capture, and death seems more likely. WWII tightens the noose further. He doesn't need to assault the Mottis directly. Time and cold are his allies. Every day he waits, his enemy grows weaker while his own forces, properly equipped, supplied, and supported, maintain their effectiveness. His orders to his commanders are explicit: contain, harass, destroy any breakout attempts, but don't waste Finnish lives in costly assaults. Let winter kill them. It's working. January 6, 1940. WWII decides the waiting is over. The Mottis along the right road have been isolated for 10 days. Soviet resistance is collapsing. The time has come to finish what winter started. He issues orders for coordinated assaults on the 3 largest Mottis, simultaneous attacks designed to overwhelm weakened defenses before Soviet forces can organize mutual support. The Finnish attack will not be a grinding siege, but a rapid, violent destruction of enemy formations too weak to resist effectively. The assault on Motti 6 begins at 0500 hours. No preparatory bombardment. Finnish forces lack heavy artillery and don't need it. Instead, ski troops infiltrate close to Soviet positions under a cover of darkness and snowfall. They move within grenade range of Soviet bunkers, positions they've observed for days, positions whose exact coordinates they've mapped and studied. The attack will be intimate, brutal, and swift. Finnish assault teams carry Suomi submachine guns, grenades, satchel charges, and knives. They're organized into small groups, 5 to 8 men per team, trained to operate independently. Each team has specific objectives: a Soviet command bunker, a weapons position, an ammunition depot. The teams advance simultaneously, coordinating not through radios, but through synchronized watches and detailed pre-assault briefings. When the attack begins, it will hit the Motti from a dozen directions at once. At 0500 exactly, grenades explode across the Soviet perimeter. Finnish teams rush forward through the smoke and confusion. A submachine gunner empties his 71-round drum magazine into a Soviet bunker. Then his squad mates throw grenades through the entrance. A satchel charge detonates against a truck being used as a command post, killing the officers inside. Knives find Soviet sentries before they can raise alarms. In 5 minutes, the Motti's defensive integrity shatters. Soviet soldiers stumble from their shelters into chaos. Finnish troops everywhere. Muzzle flashes in the darkness. Explosions. Screaming. The Soviets try to organize defensive lines, but they lack cohesion, ammunition, and, most critically, leadership. The Finnish assault teams targeted officers first. Anyone wearing insignia, anyone issuing orders, anyone trying to coordinate resistance. With their command structure decapitated, Soviet units fragmented to isolated groups fighting desperately but ineffectively. The Finns press their advantage with clinical precision. They don't advance in waves that Soviet machine guns could mow down. They advance in small groups using cover, suppressing Soviet positions with automatic fire while other teams maneuver. When Soviets concentrate to resist one Finnish team, mortars drop shells on the concentration. When Soviets retreat deeper into the Motti, Finnish ski troops already positioned behind Soviet lines cut them down. A Soviet political officer, a Zampolit, responsible for maintaining Communist Party discipline, tries rallying troops for a counterattack. He stands on a truck bed, shouting about Soviet invincibility, about cowardice being treason, about fighting to the last man for Stalin. A Finnish sniper shoots him through the chest. He falls into the snow and no one takes his place. The men he was exhorting drop their weapons and raise their hands. The Finns accept their surrender, disarm them, and point them toward the rear. The battle continues around them. By 7 o'clock, organized Soviet resistance in Motti 6 has ceased. The Finns now face the grim work of clearing the Motti completely, searching bunkers, disarming stragglers, collecting prisoners, counting bodies. They find horrors that disturb even combat-hardened veterans. Soviet soldiers frozen to death in their positions, rifles still pointed outward. Wounded men who died from exposure because they couldn't stay warm. Evidence of desperation, stripped corpses, gnawed bones, empty supply crates that once held ammunition, now serving as makeshift coffins. The Finns capture 1,300 Soviet soldiers from Motti 6. Another 600 lie dead in the snow. The remaining 1,000, already dead from cold, hunger, and wounds before the final assault, are buried in mass graves, hacked through frozen ground. Finnish casualties, 32 dead, 78 wounded. The arithmetic of the battle defies conventional military logic. A force 1/4 the size destroyed an enemy formation with minimal losses. But this isn't conventional warfare. This is winter warfare fought on Finnish terms in Finnish terrain against an enemy whose doctrine, equipment, and training left them catastrophically unprepared. 8 kilometers south, the assault on Motti 4 follows similar patterns with even more devastating results. This Motti contains elements of the 44th Division's artillery regiment, men who've survived by cannibalizing their own guns for firewood, men who've fired their last shells days ago at targets they couldn't see. Finnish troops overrun the position in less than an hour. They capture 43 artillery pieces, dozens of trucks, mountains of abandoned equipment. They capture 800 prisoners. They bury 400 Soviet dead. The third simultaneous assault targets Motti 9, the smallest pocket but the most desperate. These Soviets attempted a breakout 2 days prior, failed, and retreated into a forested hillside with no supplies and minimal shelter. They've endured minus 40-degree temperatures without fires. Lighting fires would draw Finnish mortars. Many are already dead when Finnish troops arrive. The survivors surrender immediately, grateful for the food and warmth of captivity. By January 8th, the systematic destruction of the 44th Division is nearly complete. Soviet formations that crossed into Finland with 17,000 men, 43 tanks and full divisional artillery now cease to exist as a military force. Seilasvuo's troops capture or destroy all 43 tanks, most abandoned and frozen, some destroyed by Finnish engineers, a few captured intact and pressed into Finnish service. They capture 70 artillery pieces. They seize hundreds of trucks, though most are unusable, wrecked or frozen beyond repair. They collect mountains of small arms, ammunition, equipment, enough to supply several Finnish divisions. The human cost staggers comprehension. The 44th Division suffers approximately 9,000 dead, another 5,000 captured. The remainder, maybe 3,000 men, managed to filter back to Soviet lines over the following weeks, frostbitten, traumatized, often weaponless. They arrive bearing tales of horror that Soviet authorities desperately try to suppress. The tales spread anyway. The Red Army learns what happened at Suomussalmi, and that knowledge breeds fear and doubt that undermine morale across the entire Finnish front. With the 44th destroyed, Seilasvuo turns his full attention to the 163rd Division still trapped around Suomussalmi village. The 163rd situation has deteriorated to the point of collapse. They've held the village for nearly a month, but Finnish pressure has been relentless. Supply lines severed, reinforcements destroyed. Each day brings more Finnish attacks, more casualties, more evidence that survival is impossible. The final assault on the 163rd begins January 7th. Finnish forces attack from 3 directions simultaneously, using tactics refined through weeks of combat. The Soviets defend tenaciously. These are men with nowhere to retreat, men who know capture or death are their only options. The fighting in Suomussalmi village is house to house, room to room, brutal close combat in buildings and trenches and frozen streets. Finnish troops clear Soviet positions methodically. Grenades through windows, submachine gun bursts into doorways, satchel charges against fortified positions. The Soviets fall back block by block, surrendering ground they can't hold, concentrating in an ever-shrinking perimeter. By January 8th, they hold only the village center, perhaps 500 men surrounded by Finnish forces they outnumber on paper, but can't effectively resist. The 163rd Division's commander, Kombrig Andrei Zelentsov, finally accepts reality. His division is destroyed. His men are starving, freezing, dying. Continued resistance serves no purpose except adding to the casualty count. On January 8th, he orders his remaining troops to surrender. Some refuse, political officers and die-hard communists who fight to the death rather than face capture. Most accept. They drop their weapons, emerge from their positions, and allow themselves to be taken prisoner. They've done everything asked of them. They've fought against impossible odds in impossible conditions. They've endured more than any soldier should have to endure. Now it's over. The 163rd Division's losses exceed those of the 44th, over 10,000 dead, more than 3,000 captured. Perhaps 1,000 survivors reach Soviet lines in the following weeks. The division's equipment, tanks, artillery, vehicles, supplies, falls to Finnish forces. 2 entire Soviet divisions, 30,000 men. Destroyed by 4,000 Finns in terrain that negated every Soviet advantage and amplified every Finnish strength. The Rajate Road itself becomes monument to the destruction. Finnish civilians who return after the battle describe the landscape. A 60-kilometer stretch littered with frozen corpses, burned vehicles, abandoned equipment. The road impassable, blocked by the debris of military catastrophe. They describe Soviet soldiers frozen in the positions where they died, preserved by the cold, expressions of terror or exhaustion or resignation frozen on their faces. Spring thaw will bring disease and decay, and Finnish authorities will spend months clearing the road, burying bodies, salvaging equipment. But in January 1940, the road remains a frozen graveyard, testimony to what happens when military incompetence meets tactical brilliance in the worst possible environment. Siilas Vuo's 4,000 Finns have achieved what military theorists will study for decades. They've destroyed 30,000 enemy troops while suffering fewer than 900 casualties. They've captured or destroyed enough equipment to outfit multiple divisions. They've demonstrated that terrain weather and superior tactics can overcome massive numerical disadvantages. They've proven that modern warfare in extreme conditions favors the defender who understands their environment over the attacker who brings merely superior numbers and firepower. The Battle of Suomussalmi is over. The killing has stopped, but the lessons written in blood and ice along the Raid Road are only beginning to be understood. January 9, 1940, Moscow receives confirmation of what rumors and fragmented reports have suggested for days. 2 full divisions annihilated at Suomussalmi. 30,000 men destroyed by a force 1/7 their size. The worst tactical defeat in Soviet military history since the Civil War. Stalin's response is predictable and terrible. Someone must pay. Someone must be blamed. Someone must die so that the system, the perfect socialist military machine, can be absolved of responsibility. Kombrig Alexei Vinogradov, commander of the 44th Division, never makes it back to Soviet lines. Finnish troops find his body in the forest 3 kilometers from the Raid Road, frozen solid, a pistol in his hand. The official Soviet report lists him as killed in action. The truth, whether he died fighting, executed by his own political officers, or took his own life rather than face Stalin's interrogators, dies with him in the snow. His family will be arrested within weeks. His name erased from military records. His very existence declared a counter-revolutionary lie. Kombrig Andrei Zelentsov, commander of the 163rd Division, survives the battle only to face something worse. Soviet authorities arrest him the moment he crosses back into Soviet territory. Charges: cowardice, dereliction of duty, sabotage, treason. The evidence: he lost his division. In Stalin's Soviet Union, military failure equals political betrayal. Zelentsov faces a show trial, confesses under torture to crimes he didn't commit, and receives execution by firing squad in March 1940. His wife and children disappear into the Gulag. Soviet records are purged of any mention that he existed. The purge extends beyond the division commanders. Every surviving officer from the 163rd and 44th faces interrogation. Most are arrested. Many are executed. The survivors are sent to punishment battalions, penal units assigned the most dangerous missions, expected to redeem their cowardice through death in combat. The lower-ranking survivors, the enlisted men, face suspicion and persecution. They're interrogated about why they survived when their comrades died. They're accused of desertion, of surrender, of insufficient revolutionary fervor. Some are shot, others are imprisoned. The few who avoid arrest carry the stigma of Suomussalmi for the sake, rest of their lives, survivors. Of a battle, Soviet authorities pretend never happened, but the battle cannot be hidden from the Red Army. Word spreads through the ranks. Soldiers hear what happened in Finland's forests. They hear about the cold, the starvation, the White Death skiing through darkness. They hear about divisions vanishing into snow. The propaganda machine tries to suppress these stories, tries to blame kulaks and saboteurs and foreign agents for Soviet defeats. The soldiers know better. They know that 30,000 men didn't disappear because of sabotage. They disappeared because the Red Army sent them into terrain they couldn't handle, against an enemy they couldn't defeat, with tactics that didn't work, Soviet morale across the Finnish front craters. Units refuse orders to advance into forested areas. Officers report widespread illness, soldiers self-inflicting injuries to avoid combat, a phenomenon that grows exponentially after news of Suomussalmi spreads. Desertions increase. Political officers shoot more Soviet soldiers for cowardice and defeatism than Finnish bullets kill in some sectors. The Winter War, planned as a quick demonstration of Soviet power, becomes a nightmare, draining resources and exposing military incompetence. Stalin responds with characteristic brutality. He purges the Red Army's high command again. Officers who failed to achieve objectives are arrested and executed. Commanders who spoke honestly about tactical difficulties are declared traitors. The military leadership that launched the Winter War is systematically destroyed, replaced by yes-men and political loyalists who tell Stalin what he wants to hear rather than what he needs to know. This purge will have consequences that extend beyond Finland. When Germany invades in 1941, the Red Army will be led by officers chosen for political reliability rather than military competence, a direct result of Stalin's response to failures in Finland. Yet even as Stalin rages and purges, Soviet military theorists study Suomussalmi obsessively. What happened? How could it happen? How do we prevent it from happening again? The answers force uncomfortable truths upon Soviet doctrine. The Red Army trained for European warfare, open terrain, mechanized advances, overwhelming firepower. Finland demonstrated that such tactics fail catastrophically in forests, swamps, and extreme cold. The Red Army assumed numerical superiority guaranteed victory. Suomussalmi proved that superior numbers mean nothing when terrain prevents their deployment. The Red Army believed in rigid, centralized command. Finnish forces demonstrated the advantages of decentralized, flexible tactics adapted to immediate conditions. These lessons get incorporated into Soviet doctrine, slowly, painfully, over the objections of officers who insist that Suomussalmi was an aberration caused by treason rather than a systematic failure. The Red Army develops ski troops, winter warfare training, specialized equipment for extreme cold. They study Finnish tactics, grudgingly admitting that a small nation defeated them not through luck, but through superior adaptation to conditions. By 1941, when winter halts the German advance on Moscow, Soviet forces will employ lessons learned at Suomussalmi. Finnish ski troops taught the Red Army how to fight in winter, though that debt will never be officially acknowledged. In Finland, news of the victory at Suomussalmi spreads like wildfire. The Finnish people, facing an empire 100 times their size, discover they can win. Not just survive, win, decisively. The victory galvanizes Finnish resistance and attracts international attention. Foreign journalists flood into Finland, filing stories about the plucky little nation holding off the Soviet bear. American, British, and French newspapers publish articles praising Finnish courage and Soviet incompetence. World opinion shifts dramatically in Finland's favor. Material support follows. Britain and France, technically at war with Germany, but engaged in the phony war, with minimal actual fighting, debate sending troops to Finland. They never follow through. Logistical difficulties and fear of expanding the war prevent direct intervention. But weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, and volunteers flow to Finland from across the world. American donors send money and equipment. Swedish volunteers cross the border to fight alongside Finnish forces. Even some Germans, disgusted by the Soviet-German non-aggression pact, volunteer for Finnish service. Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo becomes a national hero. His photograph appears in newspapers worldwide. He's promoted to Major General, given command of additional forces, entrusted with defending ever larger sectors of the front. But Siilasvuo remains remarkably modest about his achievement. In interviews, he credits his men, the ski troops who executed the tactics, the soldiers who endured impossible conditions, the commanders who led their units with initiative and courage. He credits Finnish sisu, that untranslatable Finnish concept meaning something like stubborn determination, the refusal to quit regardless of odds, the willingness to endure suffering without complaint. Sisu defines Finland's response to the Winter War. The nation refuses to surrender despite facing impossible odds. They refuse to abandon their independence, their territory, their way of life. They fight not because they expect to win in any conventional sense, they can't defeat the Soviet Union militarily, but because submission is unthinkable. Sisu transforms ordinary men into extraordinary soldiers, farmers into tactical geniuses, a small nation into a symbol of resistance against tyranny. The victory at Suomussalmi doesn't end the Winter War. The Soviets regroup, reorganize, and attack again in February 1940, with overwhelming force concentrated on the Karelian Isthmus. They break through Finnish defenses through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. Finland, exhausted and running out of ammunition and men, negotiates peace in March 1940. The peace terms are harsh. Finland cedes 11% of its territory, including Karelia, its second-largest city, Viipuri, and strategic regions along the border. 25,000 Finnish soldiers died. The nation is traumatized, impoverished, and diminished, but Finland survives, remains independent, maintains its sovereignty against an empire that intended to conquer or destroy it. And that survival is due in large part to victories like Suomussalmi, battles that demonstrated Finnish resistance wasn't futile gesture, but effective military reality. The Soviets paid such a terrible price for their territorial gains that annexing all of Finland became unthinkable. They killed the patient while performing surgery. Conquering Finland would cost more than any possible benefit justified. International perception of the Soviet Union shifts dramatically. The Red Army, once feared as an unstoppable force, becomes an object of mockery. Western intelligence agencies note the incompetence, the rigid doctrine, the poor performance against a small opponent. When Germany begins planning Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler and his generals convince themselves the Red Army will collapse within weeks. They cite Finland as evidence. They're wrong, catastrophically so, but the Winter War creates that impression of Soviet weakness. For Finland, Suomussalmi enters national mythology. School children learn about Silas Vuo and his ski troops. Veterans tell stories about the White Death, about Mattis, about how 4,000 Finns destroyed 30,000 Soviets. The battle becomes proof that Finns can survive anything, overcome any odds, defeat any enemy through courage and cleverness, and refusal to surrender. That mythology will sustain Finland through the Continuation War in 1941-1944, through the difficult decades of Cold War neutrality between East and West, through every crisis and challenge that follows. The Great Road, that frozen graveyard, becomes a pilgrimage site. Veterans return to walk where they fought. Historians study the terrain, trying to understand how such a victory was possible. Tourists visit, seeking connection to events that seem impossible, legendary, almost mythical. The road remains lightly traveled even today, a reminder that some places are defined not by what they are, but by what happened there. What happened at Suomussalmi changed Finland, changed the Soviet Union, changed how the world viewed winter warfare and small nation resistance against empire. The frozen bodies along the Raute Road begin thawing in April 1940. Finnish burial details work for weeks, removing corpses, salvaging equipment, clearing the route for civilian use. They find Soviet soldiers in positions where they died, behind machine guns, in foxholes, collapsed beside abandoned vehicles. They find evidence of desperate final hours, empty ammunition crates used as coffins, fires that consumed wooden rifle stocks for warmth, shallow graves where stronger men tried burying weaker comrades before succumbing themselves. The burial details are mostly older Finnish reservists, men who fought in Finland's Civil War 20 years prior. Even these combat veterans are disturbed by what they find. The scale of death, the evidence of suffering, the sheer waste of human life. Military analysts from around the world descend on Finland to study Suomussalmi. British officers walk the battlefield, measuring distances, examining Finnish defensive positions, trying to understand how such disproportionate casualties occurred. French military theorists interview Silas Vuo and his subordinates, taking notes on tactics and techniques. American observers write reports for the War Department about winter warfare, mobility, and the advantages of defending forces intimate with their terrain. German officers, operating semi-secretly due to the Soviet-German Pact, pay particular attention. They're planning their own campaign against the Soviet Union and want to understand Soviet weaknesses. The tactical lessons are clear and unambiguous. Terrain matters more than numbers when terrain prevents numerical superiority from deploying effectively. The Soviets brought overwhelming force but couldn't use it because Finnish forests, lakes, and swamps channeled movement onto narrow roads where columns became targets rather than combat formations. Modern military equipment, tanks, artillery, trucks, provides advantages only when terrain allows their employment. In deep snow and dense forest, skis outperform tanks, and men who know the landscape outfight men who don't. Soviet doctrine emphasized concentration of forces and overwhelming firepower. Finnish doctrine emphasized dispersion, mobility, and striking where the enemy was weakest. Soviet units needed supply lines, communication networks, and command hierarchies to function. Finnish units operated independently, adapted to immediate circumstances, and needed minimal logistical support. When those doctrines clashed in terrain favoring Finnish methods, Soviet advantages became liabilities. Large formations needed supplies they couldn't get. Centralized command couldn't respond to fluid battlefield conditions. Superior firepower couldn't hit targets that appeared, struck, and vanished. The human factor proves equally significant. Finnish soldiers fought on their homeland in terrain they understood for survival of their nation. Soviet soldiers fought far from home, in alien conditions, for objectives poorly explained and dimly understood. Finnish troops were led by officers who trusted their judgment and initiative. Soviet troops were led by officers terrified of making decisions without approval from superiors who didn't understand battlefield realities. When Finnish ski troops attacked at night from multiple directions simultaneously, Finnish small unit leaders responded instantly based on their assessment of the situation. Soviet counterparts froze, waiting for orders that arrived too late, or not at all. Winter warfare, previously considered an unfortunate complication to be endured rather than exploited, emerges from Suomussalmi as a distinct military discipline requiring specialized training, equipment, and doctrine. The cold isn't merely an environmental hazard, it's a weapon. Properly equipped forces can use cold to incapacitate enemies lacking proper preparation. Mobility in snow becomes decisive advantage. Armies that can move rapidly through winter terrain can outmaneuver opponents restricted to roads. Concealment in snow-covered forests becomes nearly perfect, turning traditional advantages of artillery and air power into marginal factors. The Soviet Union learns these lessons at catastrophic cost. The Red Army undertakes comprehensive reforms following the Winter War. They established dedicated winter warfare training centers in northern regions where troops learn to operate in extreme cold. They developed specialized equipment, winter uniforms actually adequate for Arctic conditions, skis and snowshoes for infantry, vehicles winterized for operation at extreme temperatures. They study Finnish tactics and incorporate them: small unit independence, use of terrain for concealment, night operations, aggressive patrolling. When Germany invades in 1941 and reaches the outskirts of Moscow in December, Soviet forces employ tactics learned from Finland. German troops, unprepared for Russian winter and unfamiliar with winter warfare, suffered defeats eerily reminiscent of Soviet disasters in Finland. Germany learns the wrong lessons from Suomussalmi. German intelligence concludes the Red Army is incompetent, poorly led, and vulnerable to determined attack. This assessment is partially accurate. Soviet performance in Finland was catastrophically bad. But German analysts fail to consider why Soviet performance was bad and whether those deficiencies would persist. They assume Soviet incompetence is systemic and permanent rather than correctable through reforms. When Operation Barbarossa launches in June 1941, Germans expect rapid collapse of Soviet forces. Early victories seem to confirm this expectation. But by December 1941, facing Soviet armies reformed and retrained, using lessons from Finland, Germans discover the Red Army of 1941 isn't the Red Army of 1939. That miscalculation cost Germany the war, the international. Community learns that small nations can resist great powers successfully if they leverage asymmetric advantages. Finland's victory inspires resistance movements worldwide. When Germany occupies much of Europe, partisan forces study Finnish tactics. Yugoslav partisans, Soviet partisans behind German lines, resistance fighters across occupied territories, all draw lessons from how Finland used terrain, mobility, and knowledge of local conditions to defeat larger forces. The concept that military might doesn't guarantee victory against determined resistance backed by favorable conditions becomes foundational to modern guerrilla warfare doctrine. American military theorists incorporate Suomussalmi into training curricula at West Point and war colleges. The battle becomes a case study in how tactical competence overcomes strategic disadvantage, how proper preparation for environmental conditions multiplies combat effectiveness, how leadership and initiative at small unit level can compensate for material inferiority. When American forces fight in Korea's harsh winters a decade later, they employ techniques Finnish troops pioneered: aggressive patrolling in extreme cold, use of terrain for concealment, emphasis on small unit leadership, specialized winter equipment. The lessons written in Finnish snow and Soviet blood become foundational to American cold weather warfare doctrine. For Finland, Suomussalmi becomes more than military victory. It becomes national identity. The battle encapsulates everything Finns believe about themselves: toughness, determination, cleverness, ability to overcome impossible odds through courage and skill. Monuments erected along the Rat Road commemorate both Finnish victory and Soviet suffering. The memorials are remarkably even-handed, honoring Finnish courage while acknowledging that thousands of Soviet soldiers died horrible deaths far from home, following orders they couldn't refuse. This remembrance reflects Finnish character, proud of victory but cognizant of war's human cost, regardless of which uniform the dead wore. Silasvuo's reputation endures. He commands Finnish forces throughout the continuation war, earning additional decorations and promotions. Post-war, he writes memoirs and lectures about winter warfare and small unit tactics. He never claims personal genius or exceptional brilliance. He attributes success at Suomussalmi to Finnish soldiers' quality, to terrain advantages, to Soviet mistakes, to fortune favoring the prepared. Modern military historians studying the battle largely agree with his assessment. Suomussalmi wasn't won by brilliant generalship alone. It was won by intersection of competent leadership, superior tactics, perfect terrain, catastrophic enemy mistakes, and extraordinary courage by ordinary soldiers who refused to accept defeat. The strategic impact extends beyond military lessons. Suomussalmi and other Finnish victories during the Winter War preserve Finnish independence at a crucial historical moment. Had Finland collapsed quickly, as Stalin expected, the nation would likely have been absorbed into the Soviet Union, becoming another Soviet Socialist republic. Finnish culture, language, and identity would have been suppressed, gradually erased through Sovietization. Instead, Finland survives as independent nation, maintaining Western democratic traditions throughout the Cold War despite existing in the Soviet sphere of influence. That survival traces directly to battles like Suomussalmi, which made conquering Finland prohibitively expensive in Soviet blood and prestige. The forests around Suomussalmi today are quiet. Young pines have grown over battlefields where men fought and died. Lakes that witnessed Soviet columns destroyed by Finnish ski troops now host summer fishing and swimming. The roads paved now, properly maintained, show no trace of the frozen bodies that once lined them. But memorials mark key locations, where the 44th Division made its final stand, where Motti 6 was overrun, where Finnish ski troops launched attacks that destroyed Soviet formations. Veterans returned to these sites for decades after the war. Finnish survivors walking paths they skied in 1939, remembering comrades lost, reflecting on impossible victory they somehow achieved. Soviet survivors, the few permitted to travel to Finland during Cold War years, standing where their units were destroyed, remembering cold and hunger and terror that haunted them for the rest of their lives. These veterans, Finnish and Soviet, sometimes met at memorial sites. They shared no common language beyond basic phrases. They represented nations with complex, painful history, but they understood each other in ways civilians never could. They'd endured Suomussalmi. That shared experience created bonds transcending nationality and politics. The last veterans of Suomussalmi died in the early 21st century. Their stories survive in memoirs, interviews, military records, and national memory. The tactical lessons they demonstrated remain relevant to modern military doctrine. Every army studies winter warfare now, trains for operations in extreme conditions, understands that environmental factors can determine battle outcomes as surely as numbers and firepower. These are lessons Finland taught the world at Suomussalmi, lessons written in the blood of 30,000 Soviet soldiers and the courage of 4,000 Finnish defenders who refused to surrender their homeland. Winter wars are fought differently now. Technology has advanced. GPS navigation, thermal imaging, advanced cold weather gear, helicopter mobility, all change the tactical calculus. But fundamental truths remain. Terrain still matters. Cold still kills. Soldiers who understand their environment still hold advantages over those who don't. Small, determined forces, leveraging asymmetric advantages, can still defeat larger forces unprepared for conditions. These truths, demonstrated so devastatingly along the Right Road in December 1939 and January 1940, remain as valid today as when Finnish ski troops ghosted through frozen forests and Soviet divisions vanished into snow, the Frozen Inferno of Suomussalmi, where Soviet might met. Finnish Sisu, in the worst possible conditions for the invader, stands as testimony to what happens when military incompetence encounters tactical brilliance. The lessons endure, the memories persist, and the snow-covered forests of eastern Finland remember, silent and eternal, the winter when 4,000 defenders destroyed 30,000 invaders and changed how the world understood war itself.